Let me tell you about a woman who stood knee-deep in a swamp on a gray morning near Eminence, Missouri. In the cold autumn of 1973, the frost had already been down twice that week. Her breath hung in the air, and her boots had gone under so far in that black bottomland mud that when she tried to lift one, the ground made a sound like it was trying to swallow her whole. There were maybe 8 men up on the dry rise of the county road, leaning on truck hoods, watching, and most of the men up there were laughing. Now here is what you need to understand about that piece of ground. It was 11 acres of low bottomland that lay along the far edge of the hollow, right where the hills gave up and let the water pool. In a wet year, it flooded to your waist. In a dry year, it stank. Nobody had ever farmed it because you could not. Cattle got mired in it. A plow sank in it. 2 men had drowned a mule in there before the war, and after that folks mostly just called it the Sloane Swamp and left it be. It was the kind of land you inherited and cursed, the kind you paid a little tax on and hoped nobody ever asked you about. The woman down in it was named Verna Sloane, and she was 34 years old. Folks had known her since she was a girl before she left. She had gone off to the city at 19, worked 12 years for a printing company that made calendars and seed catalogs. And then one Friday in the spring of that year, they closed the whole floor and sent her home with 2 weeks of pay and a cardboard box. She came back to the hollow with no husband, no savings to speak of, and no plan that anyone could see. She moved into her late mother's house, the little 4-room place near the creek, and for a few months she just walked. Her mother had passed the winter before Verna came home. That mattered, though no one knew yet how much. Verna's mother had been a quiet, hard woman who raised her alone and never had 2 nickels to rub together. And one of the few soft memories Verna carried was of walking that bottomland as a small girl in early spring, when her mother would wade out to a certain cold seep at the swamp's edge and cut handfuls of dark green wild leaves that grew there even under ice. She would carry them home in a dented tin cup, wash them, and lay them across their bread with a little salt. Verna used to say it was the only fresh green thing they ever had in February, and that her mother called it their secret garden, though it was nothing but weeds in a bog to anyone else. So when the county put the old swamp parcels up at the tax sale that autumn, Verna went, and a curious handful of neighbors went too. There were 3 lots that day, and 2 of them sold to a lumber outfit for the timber on the high ground. The third was the 11 acres of bottomland, and when the auctioneer read it out, the room actually chuckled. He asked for an opening bid and got silence. He dropped the price, and dropped it again, and nobody moved. Then Verna raised one finger and bought her mother's swamp for a sum so small it was almost embarrassing to say out loud. It was less than a used truck. A man in the back said, loud enough for her to hear, that she had just paid good money to own a mosquito farm. She heard him. She did not turn around. And this is the part that matters, because it tells you who she was. She thanked the auctioneer, folded her receipt into her coat, and drove straight out to the bottomland to walk it before she had even decided what on earth she meant to do with it. That is how she came to be standing in the mud that gray morning, while the rest of them watched and laughed. She was not doing anything grand. She was just wading, slowly, in a grid, from one end of the wet ground to the other, the way you might pace off a room. And out near the far edge, up against the base of the hill, she found what her mother had found before her. A cold spring, water coming straight up out of the gravel, so cold it made her ankles ache. So steady it never froze and never dried, running clear as glass down into the muck. And all around that seep, thick and dark and alive, even with frost on the reeds behind it, grew the same wild green her mother used to cut. She crouched down and pulled a handful and put it to her mouth right there, in front of everyone. She chewed slow. Then she stood up, looked back at all of them on the road, and something in her face had changed. She was not embarrassed anymore. She had the look of a woman who has just been handed a card the rest of the table cannot see. The men drove home. They laughed the whole way about the fool Sloane girl and her mudhole. Everybody in that hollow looked at those 11 acres and saw exactly what their fathers had seen. A worthless swamp, a place where mules drowned and money went to die. But Verna had crouched by that cold spring with the taste of pepper and green still sharp on her tongue, and she was already starting to see something none of the rest of them could. Not a swamp, a crop. Here is something worth knowing. The plant Verna tasted was watercress, and it is one of the few leafy greens that actually wants exactly the kind of place everyone else throws away. It grows in shallow, clean, moving water, and it does best where a cold spring keeps the temperature steady through the winter. Spring water often stays near 55 degrees year-round, warm enough that the cress keeps growing when every field crop is dead and frozen. That single fact, that a swamp could be greenest in February, is the whole reason a chef would one day drive 2 hours to reach it. Now, wanting a thing and knowing how to grow it are two different animals. And that winter, Verna learned the difference the hard way. She spent the cold months reading everything she could find. She wrote letters to a state agriculture office and got back a thin pamphlet that mentioned watercress in exactly one paragraph. She talked to an old market gardener 2 counties over, a man named Harlan Boyd who was near 80 and half deaf, and he told her the only real rule he knew. Cress lives on cold moving water and dies in still warm water, and everything else you figure out by killing plants. She would come to think that was the truest sentence anybody ever said to her. That first spring, in 1974, she went at it all wrong, the way beginners do. She took the money she had left, which was almost nothing, and she hired a man with a small dozer to scrape her some shallow beds out in the open flat of the bottomland, down in the middle where the ground was widest. It made sense to her eyes. Big flat beds, lots of room, lots of cress. She hauled cuttings from the wild patch by the spring, tucked them into the mud, and let the bottomland's own water fill the beds. For about 3 weeks, it looked like she was a genius. The cuttings took, the beds greened up. Then the rains came. A hard week of April storms dumped water off the whole watershed into the hollow the way it always had, and the creek jumped its bank and rolled straight across her lovely flatbeds in a brown flood. When it drained 4 days later, every cutting she had planted was gone, torn loose and washed downstream or buried under 2 inches of silt. She stood out there in the wreck of it with the mud drying on her arms and she cried. And then she did the thing that would come to define her. She stopped crying and she started measuring. She walked the flood line. She marked where the water had run fastest and where it had pooled. And here is the part that matters. She noticed that the wild cress up by the spring, the plants her mother had cut from, had not washed out at all. They sat higher, tight against the hill, in narrow channels the spring had cut for itself over the years, where the water ran shallow and cold, and quick, and never pooled. That was the whole lesson, and the flood had taught it to her for free. She had built her beds in the wrong place, out in the slow, warm belly of the swamp where floods ran and water sat. The cress did not want a pond. It wanted a creek. So that summer, she quit fighting the bottomland's water and started shaping it. She dug long, narrow, gravel-bottom channels that ran off the cold spring and fell gently downhill, so the water was always moving and always cold. And she planted the cress in those. It was brutal work, all by hand and by shovel, standing in muck to her knees in the July heat with the deer flies eating her alive. The failures were not done with her, though. That was the summer of the muskrats. A pair of them moved into the bank above her new channels and took to cutting her plants off clean at the water line, not even eating half of them, just snipping. She would come out in the morning and find a whole channel mowed down. She tried a fence and they went under it. She tried trapping and caught one and the other got wiser. In the end, old Harlan told her to run the channels shallower and faster, because muskrats like a slow, deep edge to work from. And once she did, they mostly gave up and moved off. Another problem solved sideways, by changing the water instead of fighting the animal. Then, late in that hot summer, she nearly lost the whole thing to something she could not even see at first. In one lower channel where the fall of the ground was too flat, the water slowed and warmed in the afternoon sun, and a slick brown rot crept in and turned the cress to slime almost overnight. It spread fast. She caught it only because she happened to be walking that channel at dusk and smelled it before she saw it. A sour sulfur smell coming off the water. She ripped out every rotting plant with her bare hands and cut new steeper fall into that channel to speed the water and cool it. She learned that day that still, warm water was not just unhelpful to cress. It was the enemy. It bred rot. Moving cold water was not a luxury for the plant. It was the whole difference between a crop and a stinking mess. By the end of that first real season, she was so broke it frightened her. She had eaten through the little she had. The property had cost her almost nothing to buy but everything to work, and she had not sold a single leaf. A land buyer from the county seat, a smooth fellow who bought up cheap ground and sat on it, heard she was struggling and drove out. and offered her nearly triple what she had paid, cash, on the spot. She stood in her own kitchen with the paper in her hand, and she came within a pen stroke of signing. The only thing that stopped her, she would say later, was that she went out to the beds one last time to say goodbye. And it was a still, cold October evening, and every field and garden in the hollow was going brown and dying for the year, and her channels by the spring were the greenest thing for miles, growing, in October, getting ready to grow all winter while everything else slept. She did not sign. She sent the buyer away. And that was the night the swamp finally stopped fighting her and started teaching her instead. The night she understood she was not farming against the land, but with the one thing about it everyone else had cursed. Here is something worth knowing about that turn. Watercress rot is almost always a water problem, not a plant problem. In still or warm water, oxygen drops and bacteria bloom, and the plant slimes and dies from the base up. The fix is flow and cold. Growers build long, shallow, gently sloping gravel beds so the water is always moving, always oxygenated, and always cool. A steady fall of just a few inches over a channel can be the difference between a healthy peppery crop and a sour ruin. The land does not need to be tamed. The water needs to be aimed. Her first sale, when it finally came, was almost an accident. It was the winter of 1975, and a woman named Della who cooked at the little cafe on the square in town had heard, the way people hear things in a small place, that the Sloane girl had green stuff growing out in the swamp in the dead of January. Della came out mostly to laugh, but Verna cut her a few bunches straight from the cold channel, still dripping, and Della tasted one leaf standing right there in the snow, and her eyebrows went up. It was sharp and peppery and crisp and alive. In the middle of a month when the only greens in the county came canned or came off a truck from 1,000 miles south, tired and pale. Della bought every bunch Verna had cut that day for cash out of her apron and told her to bring more Friday. Now, that would have made a nice little side living, a few bunches to a cafe, and plenty of people would have settled there. But here's the part that changed everything. Della put that cress on a plate of trout one night for a traveling man who turned out to know food, and he mentioned it a week later to a chef named Roland Ives who ran a serious restaurant in the city, 2 full hours away over back roads. And Roland Ives, being the kind of man he was, did not send a letter or make a call. He got in his car early one frozen morning and drove the 2 hours out to Eminence to see for himself where a January watercress with that kind of bite could possibly be coming from. The day he showed up, this city man in a good coat picked his way down to the channels, crouched, tasted a leaf the way Verna had tasted her first one, and went quiet for a long moment. Then he stood up and he did not gush. He said something Verna would repeat for years. He said, "This is the best cress I have put in my mouth in this country, and I do not care about that at all unless you can give me the exact same thing every single week. This bite. This size, cleaned, whether it is April or whether it is 10 below in February. Can you do that?" She said yes before she had any idea how. And meeting that one word, yes, became the hardest lesson of her whole life. Harder than the flood and the rot and the muskrats put together. Because growing good cress was one thing. Growing the same good cress, cut to the same length, the same tender stage, the same peppery sharpness, bunched clean and cold, on the same day every week, in every season, was a different trade entirely. Her wild-grown channels gave her cress in every stage at once, some too young, some gone woody and bitter and flowering, all mixed together. A restaurant could not use a box like that. Roland needed uniform. He needed the plant caught at exactly the right week of its life, over and over. So she learned to grade and to time. She learned that watercress cut young and cut often stays tender and peppery, and that if you let it stand, it bolts, throws a flower, and turns bitter and stringy. She started cutting her channels in a rotation so that a different stretch came ripe to the perfect stage every few days, and she always had cress at the right moment somewhere on the place. She learned to cut, wash in the cold spring water itself, sort out anything woody or yellow, and bunch it uniform, all in the cold so it never wilted. It was a whole system. And she built it in her head channel by channel. She failed Roland's order twice before she got it right. The first week she cut too much too old, and half the box was bitter. He called and told her plainly it was not good enough. The second week she got the stage right but packed it warm for the drive, and it wilted brown before it reached the city, and he called again, and she could hear in his voice that he was one bad week from giving up on her. Most people would have made an excuse about the distance or the weather. Verna did not. She drove the 2 hours into the city herself, walked into his kitchen, and told him flat out that both failures were hers and not the swamp's, and asked him for one more week at half the order, a size she could swear to. He looked at her a long moment and he said all right. One more week. That third box was perfect, and it stayed perfect every week after. It became a standing order, and that standing order became the spine of everything. Because Roland Ives was not a quiet man about food he loved, and he told other chefs, and this was the thing nobody could have believed. Thinking back on those men laughing on the county road 2 years before, they started to drive out. One by one, chefs from the city, and even from farther, they made the long trip over the back roads out to a swamp near Eminence to stand by a cold spring and taste a weed that grew where mules used to drown. Verna could not keep up with the calls. The hardest, most demanding customer she had ever had, the one who nearly walked away twice, had turned into the very reason her name was starting to travel. Here is something worth knowing about why that happened. Watercress is a cool season plant, and cold spring water lets it grow straight through the winter when almost nothing else fresh is coming out of the ground for hundreds of miles. For a serious cook, a crisp, peppery green in February is not a small thing. It is nearly impossible to buy fresh and local. That rarity, plus the sharp flavor that fades within a day of cutting, is exactly why a chef will drive 2 hours to get it straight from the water instead of ordering something tired off a truck. By the summer of 1976, Verna had more orders than her few channels could fill, and she came to the hardest kind of decision, the kind that has no obviously right answer. To grow, she needed more beds, and more beds meant more digging than 2 hands could do, and it meant money she did not have. So she went to the bank in the county seat, the same bank whose men had chuckled about the mudhole 2 years before, and she took out a loan she genuinely hated taking, against the very land they had all called worthless. She used it to cut a whole new set of channels off the spring's overflow, and for the first time she hired help, a young married couple from down the hollow, Merle and his wife Ruth, who needed the work and were not too proud to stand in cold water all day. Ruth turned out to have a better eye for the grading than Verna herself, and Merle could dig a channel with the right fall-by feel, and between the three of them the place became something like a real farm. They put up a little cutting shed by the spring, with cold running spring water piped right through the washing troughs, so the cress never left the cold from the moment it was cut to the moment it went in the box. She was selling to Roland and to 5 other restaurants by then, and to 2 specialty grocers in the city who could not keep it on the shelf. Then came the winter that tested all of it. In January of 1977, a freeze rolled down out of the north, the likes of which the old men in the hollow could not remember. 10 below and then 20 below, night after night. Now, the spring water itself never froze. It came up too warm and too fast for that, and that was the whole secret of the place. But in that killing cold, ice began to form along the shallow edges of the channels and creep inward, and a skin of ice over the cress would freeze the leaves and turn a whole season's crop to black mush in a night. Every account she had was counting on her January cress, the very thing nobody else in the country could supply. And she was about to lose it all to a week of weather. Here is what saved her, and it was not money or luck. It was a habit. From that very first flood, Verna had walked her beds every single morning before sunrise, in every weather, out of nothing but the fear of missing something. So on the first brutal night, she was out there in the dark at 4 in the morning with a lantern, and she saw the ice starting to reach in from the edges while the spring water still ran warm and open down the center. And she understood, standing there half frozen, that the answer was to make the water run faster and fuller, to open the spring wide and flood the channels a little deeper, so the warmer moving water kept the ice pushed back off the plants. She and Merle spent 3 nights barely sleeping, working the flow, breaking edge ice by hand, keeping that warm spring water moving over the cress. And it held. When the freeze finally broke, her channels were green and alive, and hers was the only fresh cress for 500 miles. And that February, she sold every leaf she could cut at a price she once would not have dared to ask. That was the winter she crossed into real money, what folks would call 6 figures over the year that followed, though it did not come as one big stroke. It came the way real things come, one steady account, and one hard-won week at a time, until one day she added it up and could hardly believe the number. The bank that had chuckled now called her a valued customer, and the men who had laughed on the county road when a fine city car came rolling out toward the Sloane place did not laugh anymore. They just watched, the way they always had, except now they were waiting to see what she would do next. Late one evening that spring, Verna walked out alone to the cold seep where it had all started, the wild patch her mother used to cut, and she finally understood a thing she had been turning over for 4 years. She had always thought her mother left her a swamp, a worthless piece of trouble. The way poor families leave each other worthless things. Standing there, she understood it was never the land at all. Her mother had waded out to that cold spring in February when there was nothing else green in the world, and had seen a garden where everyone else saw a bog, and she had raised a daughter who could do the same. That was the inheritance. Not the 11 acres, the eye. Near the end of her working years, when someone asked what she made of the whole thing, she gave the only moral she ever offered. In her own plain words, she said, "Most everything folks throw away isn't worthless. It's just waiting on somebody willing to look at it long enough to see what it already is." My mother knew that. It took me losing near everything to learn it. The swamp was never the swamp. It was the one thing about the place that scared everybody else off, and that turned out to be the only thing worth having. Here is a last thing worth knowing. Watercress is one of the most nutrient-dense greens there is, rich in vitamins and minerals for almost no calories, and it thrives in wetlands that most farming treats as useless. A healthy spring-fed cress bed is also a small living system, cleaning the water and sheltering insects, snails, and birds. The very ground drained and written off as worthless swamp is often the rarest and most valuable kind of land there is, if you know what wants to grow there. To this day, out at that cold spring near Eminence, hung on a nail on the post of the little cutting shed, there is a small dented tin cup, and nobody who works there is ever allowed to take it down.